Manhattan Project, and that was 65 years ago. So you all know it's not going to be a spoiler. We won. So this is just to give you some background. I don't know how many of you, I know that the class is reading White Sands Red Menace, which is the sequel to Green Glass Sea. And so this book introduces the characters Dewey and Suze. When this book starts out, they are not quite 11, and they are on their way. They live in Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is a town that doesn't exist because it's where they are building the atomic bomb. I actually managed to get through the entire book without using the word atomic once, which confuses fourth graders because they don't know what it's about. And they get to the end and they still don't know what it's about. But you're not fourth graders, so I think this will be okay. So this is at the end of in July of 1945, they tested the first bomb that they'd been working on to make sure that it worked in the desert in the southern middle part of New Mexico, in pretty much the middle of nowhere, which is where you would want to test an atomic bomb. And 3 weeks later, some of the scientists took their families down to show them what Daddy had been working on. And that was kind of what got me started on all this. I read one sentence about that and thought, well, there's a bad idea. Let's take our kids down to an atomic test site for a picnic. But it's 1945, and they really didn't know how dangerous any of this was. So this is the last scene in Green Glass Sea. It was barely light when Mrs. Gordon woke them the next morning. Dr. Gordon had gotten 2 cups of coffee in paper cups from the cafe, and Cokes for the girls, even though it was breakfast. The air was still and already warm, and everything was very quiet. They drove south and then west for an hour, the rising sun making a long dark shadow in front of the car. For about a mile there was nothing on either side of the car but burnt, crumbly-looking rock. An old lava flow, Dr. Gordon said. Mal Pais, the bad country. Then the road wound up and down hills dotted with cactus and sagebrush silvery green against the brick-red dirt. There were no houses or landmarks, nothing much to see out the window or on the map. At an unmarked dirt road, Dr. Gordon turned left. The car raised plumes of dust so thick that Dewey could see where they were going, but no longer where they'd been. Thin wire ran between wooden fence posts, separating the red dirt of the road from the pale pink beige of the desert sand and the bright yellow flowers of spiky yucca plants. After half an hour, they came to a gate with an MP. He seemed to be guarding more empty desert. They showed their passes and the Gordons' Los Alamos badges. The man nodded and waved the car through, then closed the gate behind them. Dr. Gordon pulled the car off to the side of the road a mile later and turned off the engine. It ticked slowly in the hot, still air. "Daddy, where are we?" Suze asked after a minute. He didn't seem to be anywhere. They had stopped in the middle of a flat, featureless desert, scattered with construction debris, pieces of wooden crates, lengths of wire and cable, flattened sheets of metal. Low mountains loomed to the east, and the far western horizon was broken by the soft shapes of another distant range. Dr. Gordon smiled. "This is Trinity," he said. "I thought you'd want to see it. Let's walk." They started to cross the dirt. There were no plants, none at all, not even grass or yucca, just reddish beige, sandy dirt. Every few yards there was a charred greasewood bush. Each bush was twisted at the same odd angle, like a little black skeleton that had been pushed aside by a big wind. They kept walking. The skeletons disappeared, and then there was nothing at all. It was the emptiest place Dewey had ever seen. After about 5 minutes, Dewey looked down and saw burn spots that looked like little animals, like a bird or a desert mouse had been stenciled black against the hard, flat ground. She looked over at Mrs. Gordon. Mrs. Gordon stopped walking. She stood a few yards back from the others, her lips pressed tight together, staring down at one of the black animal shapes. "Christ," she said, "what have we done?" She lit a Chesterfield and stood there for almost a minute, then looked up at Dr. Gordon, who walked back to her. "Phil, is this safe?" She looked around, holding her arms tight across her chest as if she were cold, although the temperature was already in the 80s. He nodded. Ground Zero's still pretty hot, but Oppie says the rest is okay, as long as we don't stay out too long. 10 minutes, we'll be fine. Dewey wasn't sure what he was talking about. Maybe sunburn. There wasn't any shade. There wasn't anything. Mrs. Gordon nodded without smiling. A few minutes later, Dewey saw her reach down and take Suze's hand, holding it tight. They kept walking through the empty place. And then, just ahead of them, the ground sloped gently downward into a huge green sea. Dewey took a few more steps and saw that it wasn't water, it was glass. Translucent jade green glass everywhere, coloring the bare empty desert as far ahead as she could see. It wasn't smooth like a Pyrex bowl or sharp like a broken bottle, but more like a giant candle that dripped and spattered green wax everywhere. Dr. Gordon reached down and broke off a piece about as big as his hand. It looked like a green twisted root. He gave it to Suze. "Happy birthday, kiddo," he said. "This is what I really wanted you to see. The boys call it trinitite." Suze turned the glass over and over in her hand. It was shining on the top with some little bubbles in places, like a piece of dark green peanut brittle. The bottom was pitted and rough and dirty where it had been lying in the sand. "Is it very old?" she asked. He shook his head. "Very, very new. 3 weeks today. It's the first new mineral created on this planet in millions of years." He sounded very proud. Dewey counted back in her head. Today was August 6th. 3 weeks ago was when they got up early and saw the bright light. "So the gadget made this?" she asked. "Yes. It was so hot that it melted the ground. Over 100 million degrees, hotter than the sun itself. It fused 75 acres of this desert sand into glass." "How is that going to win the war?" Dewey asked. "It'll melt all the Japs," Suze said. "Right, Daddy?" Mrs. Gordon winced. "Well, if cooler heads prevail," she said, "we'll never have to find out, will we, Philip?" She gave Dr. Gordon a look, then took a few steps away and stared out toward the mountains. "You girls go on, take a walk around," he said, glancing back at his wife. "But when I call you, you scamper back here pronto, okay?" Dewey and Suze both nodded and stepped out onto the green glass sea. The strange, twisted surface crunched and crackled beneath their feet as if they were walking on braided ice. They walked in from the edge until all they could see was green, splattered at their feet, merging into solid color at the edges of their vision. "I didn't know war stuff could make anything like this," Suze said. "It looks like kryptonite, or what they'd build the Emerald City out of." Suze reached down and picked up a long, flat piece. "A Wicked Witch of the West's powerful magic glass." She held it out at arm's length. "It's a nifty green," she said. "It changes when you turn it in the light." She watched the sun play on its surface for a minute, then pulled the bottom of her seersucker blouse out to make a pouch and dropped it in. "I'm going to take some home." Dewey stood still, then turned slowly around, trying to take it all in. This place was more wonderful than anything she could have imagined. Sometimes, when Papa talked about how beautiful math and science were, his voice sounded just the way she felt now. She knelt down and put her hand flat on the green surface. "Papa helped make this," she whispered. She wasn't sure who she was talking to, but it felt right to say it out loud. After a minute, she stood up and walked carefully across the jade-colored ground, looking for one perfect piece to take back with her. The glassy surface was only about half an inch thick, and many of the pieces she picked up were so brittle they crumpled and cracked apart in her hands. One odd, rounded lump had a thin casing on the outside that shattered under her fingers like an eggshell, revealing a lump of plain dirt inside. She finally chose a flat piece about the size of her hand, spread out. Dewey was looking closely at a big patch infused with streaks of reddish-brown when Dr. Gordon whistled. "Come on back, now," he called. She caught up with Suze, who had filled her shirt tails with pieces of the green glass in all shapes and sizes, and was holding the fabric in both hands. "It's a good thing you're here, too," Suze said, gesturing with her head. "No one else would believe this." Dewey didn't say anything, but put her hand on Suze's elbow. They walked back in silence, holding their fragile treasure. At the edge, Dewey stopped and turned around, trying to fold the image into her memory like a photograph. Then she stepped back onto the bare, scorched dirt.